The poster did not rot in the rain. It peeled slowly, as if the paper itself was embarrassed by what had been printed on it. In the last winter of the war, there were still corners of German towns where tattered placards and handbills insisted that monsters were coming. The Allies, the partisans, the black American soldiers whose faces were caricatured into masks of appetite. The louder the regime shouted, the fewer people believed it, but the noise did its work. Fear is cheap, and fatigue loves a story that explains everything badly. Then the trucks arrived, the street filled with uniforms that came attached to men who counted coins and wrote receipts, and a certain kind of lie folded in on itself. Another uniform, darker and cut to a sharper angle, did not fold. The black of the Schutzstaffel had promised immunity when it marched. It had functioned like a spell. Inside camps surrounded by wire and law rewritten for convenience, men in that uniform learned to move as if the world held no balances that could weigh them. They mistook the fabric for the force. The end of the war taught them a different grammar of power. Archives, witnesses, signatures, and the stubborn patience of lawyers who could thread decades of excuses into a rope and pull. This is the story of one of those men and the paper trail that unspooled behind him. Erich Muhsfeldt was not a cartoon villain at first glance, and that fact matters because propaganda drawers prefer cartoons. He had a birthday like anyone, 1913, in Neubrück. He had a trade like anyone, apprenticed as a baker, a profession that measures time by yeast and heat instead of by whistles and orders. He learned to weigh flour with a hand that found pride in consistency. The Germany into which he rose to adulthood valued other weights. A bruised republic promised the kind of certainty that can be printed on armbands. Organizations offered belonging in exchange for obedience, and uniforms offered a shortcut around the old, slow road of earning respect. He took the shortcuts that were on offer. The Sturmabteilung in 1933, when joining felt to many like a ticket out of humiliation. The Schutzstaffel by 1937, when the black coat conferred the look of a man the state would not ask to explain himself. And the party in 1939, when war swallowed questions. Uniforms are habits made visible. The habit that mattered most in Erich Muhsfeldt's case was not saluting in unison or marching in step. It was signing. Bureaucracy is the nervous system of atrocity. Every transfer, every duty roster, every materials requisition dragged ink across paper, and wherever ink went, a trail remained for people who would come later and refuse to be shouted over. The SS liked to imagine that terror needed no receipts. In the camp system, especially in the Totenkopf formations that specialized in guarding and killing, the receipts piled up anyway. Personnel files, shifts in crematoria crews, orders assigning men to special duties, notes that pretended to prettify murder with words like selection and evacuation. In that stack, Muhsfeldt's name recurs often enough to prove a point he did not want proven. He could not hide behind the lie that there had been no choices. He made them on paper. He made them in rooms where other human beings stood 3 steps away. He made them knowing that signatures outlive boasts. The phrase, propaganda-painted monsters, belongs beside this other truth. Power painted immunity. When liberation began to speak in the language of receipts and measured bread lines, the lie about black American soldiers collapsed without the need for slogans. When justice began to speak in the language of dates, duty rosters, and testimonies that converged from a dozen throats onto the same names, the lie of the black uniform's immunity collapsed with it. Muhsfeldt's trajectory shows both collapses at once. His early life offers the ordinary scaffolding we all build: work, belonging, ambition. His wartime service with the Totenkopf formations and in the camp system shows how belonging can be weaponized by institutions that demand the surrender of conscience. His post-war reckoning shows how archives and law reach through uniforms and pull out the person wearing them. The bench that sentenced him did not speak for vengeance. It spoke for the dead and for the living who needed to know that the promise whispered by black cloth, that you could do anything and be no one, had been revoked. Neubrück in 1913 would have smelled of damp timber and ovens. A baker's apprentice learns the grammar of discipline without ever calling it that. Arrive before light, measure with care, trust your hands over your eyes because flour can fool you. Let heat do its slow mathematics. Do not rush what will punish you for rushing. The apprenticeship bent Erich Muhsfeldt's days into a shape that felt like predictability. The Great War had taught a different shape to the country. Loss, inflation, men who returned older than their years, and boys who never returned at all. Between bakery mornings and the newspaper's jagged headlines, a young man could find a story in which his craft felt too small and his anger too big. The post-war republic asked for patience. The streets offered parades. Patience rarely wins the contest when parades are fed with drums. It matters to say that tens of thousands of men apprenticed and did not step towards the brown shirts. It also matters to track the path of one who did, because the habit of obedience learned over ovens can be twisted when it is rerouted through uniforms that promise a more flattering discipline. The Sturmabteilung, the early street muscle of the movement, did not look like inevitability in 1933. It looked like excitement with a crest. If you were a young man with calloused hands and a hunger to be part of something larger than your shop, the SA's roar was a tempting music. It offered the illusion that belonging could be earned by standing in formation rather than by showing up before dawn and sweating over dough. In the belly of that temptation was a trade of one discipline for another, the quiet, measured acts that feed neighbors for the loud, marching acts that frighten them. By 1937, when Muhsfeldt entered the SS, the movement's costumes had been tailored into power. The black uniform was made to do what black coats have always done for authority: impose a silhouette, erase a person. It carried with it an invitation to a different species of pride, one that preened in front of mirrors and learned to see eyes lower when it approached. The SS did not recruit bakers to make bread. It recruited them to make obedience. That career switch from craft to command did not change the habit of the hand that signs. It repurposed it. A shop ledger had tallied flour. A duty roster would tally bodies. If Erich thought he was rising out of smallness into history, he was right, but not in the way pamphlets promise. History remembers the ink that stains. Apprenticeships teach fingerprints. Bureaucracies record them. Party membership in 1939 made the circle complete. War rewarded men who stood under banners. The black coat grew a second skin in which its wearer could walk past neighbors and feel the slosh of fear in the air, as if he waded through a shallow, warm pond. The temptation of that feeling should not be underestimated. It is an intoxicant. Men who would blush to take a coin they had not earned will smile while taking a salute they did not deserve. In the hierarchy that the SS built for itself, Totenkopfverbände to guard and execute, Allgemeine SS to administer, Waffen-SS to fight. The lines hardened and the pen strokes multiplied. Muhsfeldt stepped where the lines were darkest. He left the quiet labor that feeds mouths and entered the loud labor that closes them. A man can tell himself that the state has replaced the village. A man can tell himself that he will be safe if he is needed by a machine. The machine tolerates that belief only as long as it needs hands. The paper trail begins at the office door and does not end there. The Totenkopf formations taught a particular dialect, euphemism as policy. In orders, the work of guarding and killing became special duty or assignment for the good of the camp. In requisitions, a furnace brick was a repair item. In rosters, an execution squad was a detail. The language served two functions. It shielded consciences that preferred to be dim, and it created paperwork that sounded like maintenance instead of murder. The transfer that brought Erich Muhsfeldt into the concentration camp system read like a promotion, because the system could only speak that way about itself. The bureaucratic ladder put him where power needed men who would not blink. Postings that included Auschwitz and Majdanek, environments where the SS's theory of human beings as problem stock was performed with the rigor of an industry. Personnel files are not literature, but patterns in them read like plot. Muhsfeldt's name appears beside crematoria and the prisoner details assigned to them. Duty rosters set him over crews whose work required a kind of mechanized numbness, and survivor testimony later filled in what the documents could not say without stripping their own varnish. That following orders was an insult to the visible choices in the room. When a guard shifts a lever on a furnace, when he barks at a prisoner detail to move faster, when he signs to accept a delivery of fuel, he is not a wind-blown leaf. He is an actor, and the script he recites is one he has agreed to help write. The camp system relied on this cooperation, on men who would turn words into heat, heat into ash, and ash into bureaucracy that could be filed away like an account settled. The distances were short. A man in a black coat might walk 20 paces and cover the ground between his desk and the edge of a pit where words like process and transport fell down and broke their masks. The machine built for atrocity was not a metaphor to the men who spirited it into motion each shift. It was an array of levers, doors, valves, schedules, and ledgers, each with its own blank for a name. Paper tied the machine together. The SS loved order. Order is easy to count and difficult to admit. In court, order can be made to testify. When later prosecutors would unroll rosters and reconcile them against survivor accounts and scraps of correspondence, they would point to the act of signature as an act of self-portraiture. Erich Muhsfeldt's handwriting did not contain the whole story of any day, but it contained enough to deny the claim that he had been carried along. He had steered. He had initialed. He had requested additional capacity, where capacity meant something it cannot mean anywhere a baker returns to labor after dawn. There is a sentence survivors used often when asked to describe men like him. He was not a shout, he was a procedure. It does not make him smaller, it makes him more dangerous. Shouts can be opposed. Procedures slip into bones. The Totenkopfverbände specialized in making procedures seem like weather. A shift begins. A whistle blows. The work proceeds. In such a world, the kind of courage required to refuse rises to a height most of us hope never to measure ourselves against. The point of a machine is to convince its operators that they are not the machine. Paper, later, would undo that lie under lights that refused to dim. When survivor testimonies surfaced, some in the first months after liberation, others in the tired, halting years that followed, the sentences were careful, even when the memories were knives. People who had learned to save breath spoke precisely. Names were not always remembered. Faces were. Habits lodged harder than hierarchies. A witness might say, "He stood with his hand on the lever," or "He checked the list and pointed left," or "He told us to hurry and laughed without sound." And the convergence of such glances across separate testimonies did something no single affidavit can do. It created a composite portrait that recurred under different pens. The collapse of "I was only following orders" began the first time one of those pens traced a choice onto a page. A man cannot be only following when he signs to receive, when he selects a crew, when he improvises a cruelty to solve an inconvenience he could have refused to create. It is important, in recounting such scenes, not to turn pain into theater. The camps can make voyeurs out of people who would be ashamed to admit it. The point here is not to repeat atrocity for its own sake, but to explain why the paper trail mattered. Every time a survivor's sentence landed on a detail, the smell of fuel on his sleeve, the way he tapped ash into the floor with the heel of his boot, the clipboard that never left his hand. Prosecutors found a place to pin a document. Fuel requisitions matched months. Rosters matched days. Clipboards matched names to shifts. The convergence worked in both directions. Paper led to people, and people led back to paper. In that loop, a defense popular among men in black uniforms wore through, that the machine had moved itself, and that they had been mere cogs. Cogs do not sign. Cogs do not order repairs. Cogs do not walk to the end of a platform and choose who descends and who does not. The dignity of those who told what they remembered did not require hatred to make its points. Many witnesses spoke with a flatness that comes not from indifference, but from the exact opposite. From the knowledge that emotion can flood a telling and leave the edges blurred. The courts learned to recognize that tone as credibility's older cousin. When three strangers, years and towns apart, describe the same walk, the same gesture, the same clockwork around a furnace door, it becomes offensively silly to pretend that orders are a sufficient explanation for anything. Orders can be refused. Orders can be misinterpreted on purpose. Orders can be quoted back at a boss with a question mark at the end. In rooms where refusal meant death, the law did not romanticize the refusal that did not come. It simply refused to pretend that a signed name had no owner. When the war's noise thinned enough for the sound of paperwork to be heard, the first arrests looked to some like a kind of impoliteness. Men who had strutted through gates with skulls on their caps did not imagine that they would be led through other gates with their hands tied. The arrogance bled slowly, because arrogance always believes it can draft an exception. Interrogations began not with thunder, but with calendars. Where were you in this month? Who signed this roster? Why did you request extra fuel here? Swagger has no grammar for footnotes. The men who had been able to end arguments with a glance found themselves asked to explain in rooms where the only loud thing was a sheaf of carbon copies. Some of them discovered, to their astonishment, that they had no stories that could survive another man's turn with the same stack. Extradition taught another lesson to those who had mistaken national defeat for the end of personal jeopardy. Countries that had been turned into execution grounds insisted on holding their trials at home. The Polish post-war process was particularly blunt in its insistence that law would meet atrocity on the ground where the atrocity had happened. Camp officers were moved along chains of custody that felt to them like a parody of their own logistics. Trains that had once been requisitioned to move prisoners now moved their former guards toward rooms with benches and transcripts. Erich Muhsfeldt learned, like others, that distance did not dilute evidence. Archives do not respect borders. They only respect box numbers. In the interrogation rooms, the idea of "I followed orders" arrived early and left late, like a guest too proud to leave without finishing his drink. Investigators had learned to peel it. They would place a document that required initiative beside one that required assent, and ask the man in the chair to explain the seam. They would read aloud from a roster that put him in the right place at the right hour, and then ask him to remember the weather. Memory faltered where paper did not. In some faces, the breakdown looked like sweating. In others, it looked like indignation misfiled as courage. The operators of a machine built for atrocity could not conceal in those rooms that the machine had kept its own diary. The courtroom in which the reckoning culminated did not attempt theater, though journalists will always find its cousins. The Polish post-war trials built their cases like carpenters. First, the frame. The legal structure that defined crimes against humanity and war crimes, statutes that had blossomed in the soil of precursors, The Hague, Geneva, reinterpreted in the light of a scale of gore that those earlier conferences had refused to predict. Then the joists, the connection between policy and act. A state can intend, a person must do. Prosecutors put policy documents on one table and watched them grow hands as they were paired with duty rosters, requisitions, transfers, and command signatures. If the policy said accelerate evacuation, and the requisition said increase fuel to crematoria, and the roster said detail assigned under Muhsfeldt, the woodwork became a room. On-site inspections kept the room from floating. Judges and prosecutors stood where prisoners had stood and looked at doors that had swung the way testimony described. They counted paces from office to oven. They measured how long it takes to walk from a barracks to a firing ditch. They asked questions that turn abstraction into nails. Can you see the platform from this window? How many steps to the control wheel? If a man says he could not hear the screams, take him to the place and ask him to stop lying, dignified by the fact that he can no longer hide behind distance. The idea that rank could shield a man from responsibility withered in the presence of such geography. Posters had once insisted that the uniform was the man. The law insisted that the man was in the uniform, and that he would fit behind a defendant's table like any other. The verdict was not a surprise to anyone who had read the indictment like a map instead of like a rumor. The court's language balanced anger with architecture. It acknowledged the machine. It refused to forgive the operator. Crimes against humanity were not allowed to be drowned in the ocean of war. That big word that excuses too often, the particular. The sentence, death by hanging, reflected both mourning and warning. It spoke for the dead in the only tense available to them. It spoke to the living about the limits of I was told to. No one spoke the word monster because the court did not need masks. It needed names, dates, signatures, and the courage to say that a profession, baker, does not inoculate anyone against becoming what orders beg for when conscience is cheap. The legal framework that carried the case did not invent morality. It codified what any neighbor knows when a neighbor has been killed. Crimes against humanity and war crimes are phrases that sound, to ears not trained by loss, like rhetoric. In court, they behave like tools. A crime against humanity says, if you participate in a program that treats an entire category of human beings as material to be processed, your acts are not excused by the fact that your state wrote the policy. War crimes say, if you mistreat prisoners, kill civilians, or deploy methods that hope to erase the line between combat and murder, your rank is not armor. The Allied courts had learned, in the first seasons after victory, that they would be asked to render justice without drifting into revenge. Their answer was to prefer paper over anger and precision over theater. They rejected the shield of rank with a simple economic insight. Immunity creates demand. If uniforms could excuse acts, every atrocity would rush to dress itself in cloth. Just following orders is the law's favorite straw house to test against fire. The courts did not pretend that disobedience was a free, safe option for all. They acknowledged risk and then asked a different question. Where did you take initiative? Where did you exceed? Where did you adjust the procedure to make death quicker, disposal tidier, terror more efficient? Those questions break the back of the passive voice. Prosecutors paired them with the documents that mark initiative, requests for additional materials, memos proposing changes in workflow, signatures accepting responsibilities beyond the minimum. In that pairing, the story of a man who could not help himself becomes the story of a man who helped. If a baker changes the shape of a loaf, you can see his hand in the result. If an SS officer changes the tempo of a killing factory, you can see his hand in the ash. What the jurisprudence achieved, in practical terms, was modest and immense. Modest because a trial can touch only the defendants it can summon. Immense because the rulings scribbled the word person across a landscape that had tried to erase the word. Person is the antithesis of monster in law. Monsters do not have agency. People do. Monsters require exorcism. People can be judged. The bench spoke for the dead without turning the living into demons, which would have made the same mistake propaganda had made, replacing understanding with a mask. The sentence affixed to Erich Muhsfeldt's name did not pretend to repair what he had helped break. It insisted that names are not decorative. While the courts were assembling their rooms of wood and paper, streets in towns like Wiesbaden were learning a different lesson about uniforms. Black American soldiers who had been painted as monsters by posters and radio voices carried out occupations with rituals meant to prevent humiliation from growing into hatred. Receipts, guards posted at bakeries, medics who counted old people before they counted weapons, the little strategies of order, worked like public antidotes to the story that said these men would plunder and assault. The contrast mattered because the same population that had been told to fear black faces had been trained to worship black coats. When the receipts stacked and the bread lines stayed calm, the shine came off the myth of SS immunity even for those who had enjoyed its shadow. The uniform that had promised indulgence for its wearers began to look like a liability in hallways outside courtrooms. People who could remember the smell of burned documents would come to prefer the smell of ink on chits that proved someone had paid for flour. The dual collapse of the myth that the liberators were monsters and the myth that the oppressors were untouchable tightened the narrative around men like Muhsfeldt in a way that even he could not wriggle out of. A policeman's signature in a ruined German street said that the rules still existed. A prosecutor's finger on a roster in a Polish courtroom said that the rules had always existed, even when men pretended they did not. Between those gestures lay the usefulness of institutions that had been mocked by uniforms for a dozen years. The irony is tidy enough to fit on a poster. The same black soldiers mocked by propaganda kept the peace with ledgers. The same SS officers lionized by propaganda were measured by ledgers to which they had contributed their own names. The difference between those ledgers is simple. Who is protected by the line items? In a street, the receipts protect the hungry. In court, the records protect the truth. To the families of the dead, no sentence sounds like music. It sounds like accounting. The word hanging does not comfort. What comforts, if anything can, is the knowledge that names do not sink. That a man who wore a black uniform like armor learned that paper survives smoke. That a country that had been turned into a factory for disappearing could, after a pause for breath, speak the word responsibility without irony. The liberation of streets and the liberation of archives are cousins. Both take uniforms and make them smaller than the bodies wearing them. Both prefer receipts to threats. Both insist that the opposite of propaganda is not propaganda with new heroes. It is observation, procedure, and the refusal to accept that a costume is a soul. The sentence in 1948, death by hanging, arrived at the end of a line of dates that had turned a life into a record. There is no romance to be found in the geometry of a gallows. Courts pretend to know poetry. They prefer that others do not bring any either. The execution did not erase what had happened while Erich Muhsfeldt wore his black coat and issued or obeyed orders that made people into numbers. It did, however, mark the end of his belief that the coat had made him a silhouette immune to light. Records closed. Boxes were labeled. Witnesses went home and tried to wring some sleep out of nights that had learned to push back. The archives absorbed the case the way a forest absorbs a body. Not to forget, but to grow rings around it that mark a year of reckoning. Aftermath is where societies learn to speak in their own voices again. Poland, trying to live amid ruins and graveyards, chose to make law walk the ground where crimes had walked. Germany, trying to breathe with new lungs, chose to let some trials happen at home and others away, and to live with the discomfort that follows any choice that admits neighbors into its shame. The Allies, trying to prove that victory was not simply another way to right impunity, chose to make trials boring in the best sense. Precise, cross-referenced, underlined. In that boredom lies one of the few clean gifts we have to offer the dead. We will not turn your wreckage into spectacle. We will count it until the counting runs out of breath, and then we will count once more to make sure the book closes without a trick. Memory, for its part, splits into streams. In some homes, the story becomes a caution to children about what uniforms do to spines. In others, it becomes a warning about what laziness does to eyes. Archivists, those patient natural enemies of drama, continue to unbox, to catalog, to resist the romance of forgetting. Lawyers who were clerks in those trials grow old and teach students who will point to footnotes in cases that feel, to the living, like a museum, and to the dead, like a door that was finally locked. The name Erich Muhsfeldt does not need to be famous to be useful. It needs to be legible. Legibility is the opposite of immunity. Propaganda's genius is its confidence. It points and names and repeats and praises itself for the echo. It cannot survive receipts. The poster that called the liberators monsters flapped in a breeze it could not stop, and the street beneath it filled with men who insisted on paying for flour. The black coat that called itself immunity met a stack of paper that included its own signatures. The courage the moment demanded was not cinematic. It was administrative. It was the courage to insist that words like person, responsible, and paid belonged on lines that had been scribbled over with slogans. The men in the 761st and in the 92nd Division, in their separate theaters, carried that courage into alleys and piazzas. The prosecutors and judges carried it into courtrooms. In both places, the remedy for monsters was the same. Do not call anyone that. Call them by their names, and then pay attention to their acts. There is a temptation, when closing a story like this, to soften everything into a moral that fits nicely on a magnet. Resist it. Keep the edges. Remember the baker's apprentice who learned to measure and later learned to ignore the weight of a life. Remember the survivors who refused to surrender the habit of exactness, even when exactness forced them to relive hours that break hearts. Remember the soldiers whom a state had insulted for a lifetime, who chose to behave in a way that made freedom believable. Remember the law, boring when it is at its best, patient when it matters, relentless without swagger. If you must keep only one sentence, keep this one. Personal accountability is not a slogan. It is a record. The record in this case begins with a boy who learned to bake, swerves into a uniform that taught him to sign, and ends at a bench that spoke for the dead. The poster in the rain did not hold. The paper in the archive did. That is how the balance tilted back from costume toward person, from rumor toward fact, from the last mean confidence of propaganda toward the quiet certainty that comes when a clerk writes a name and a court reads it aloud. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better counter-charms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better countercharms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better countercharms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better countercharms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better counter-charms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better counter-charms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better counter-charms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better counter-charms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning. If there is a final craft to be learned from this episode, it is the craft of reading. Read uniforms as claims, not as proofs. Read orders as evidence of a mind choosing among paths. Read receipts as civic poetry, the kind that binds strangers who have nothing in common except the need to eat in peace. Read testimonies without voyeurism, for what they align rather than for what they inflame. Read archives as antidotes to the delirium that uniforms produce in crowds. When enough people in a country learn that craft, posters still tear, but they do so faster. Uniforms still swagger, but they are met at the curb by clerks with pens. If it sounds small, think of how many lives have been saved by small things. A signature that refused to vanish. A rule enforced the hard way, because the easy way would have been someone else's suffering. A bench that put its patience on record. Against the spell of impunity, there are few better counter-charms than paper, names, and the collective will to keep them from burning.